So now for our last event of the day, we're lining up for the Q&A session. It's a 40-minute session, so I really do want you to get involved. So please do, with that QR code, send through your questions or do it via the webcast because we have such a great lineup of panelists to come. And we're going to be exploring some of the subjects that we've already touched on, but also taking a wider perspective. Air Vice-Marshal Paul Godfrey, who is Commander of the United Kingdom Space Command. Great to have you with us. Also Air Vice-Marshal Phil Robinson, Air Officer commanding 11 Group and 2-star lead for current operations, are welcome as well. Welcome back to the stage, of course, in Muldowney, Chief Operating Officer for BAE Systems, and also welcome back Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute, and also Jeremy Poulter, Director of UK Defence and National Security at Microsoft. Welcome. Thanks very much. So I think really just to kick off, let's take a bit of a wider question to start off with, one that we really have been focusing on today. Do we really have the agility and flexibility within our military thinking to be prepared for the next war, to be more prepared for the next war than the last? What's your take on this, Paul Godfrey?
I think we've got a huge advantage in starting UK Space Command. So we can actually look back on some of the things that have gone before us, look at the mistakes that have been made, and certainly I think a few people have talked about agility. That's one thing we're really striving for in agility in procurement, actually, with the defence space portfolio of the programme that Harv Smith talked about. It's difficult. You know, we are being drawn back into, we're in the tractor beam of the Death Star of defence acquisition. But from the top of the shop, from CDS through to Chief of the Air Staff, they are giving us all of the tools that we need to be able to get to it. So it's difficult, but we are trying on a minute-by-minute basis, especially as we start a new organisation.
Okay, well, that segues into the next question. Are we ready for the next war? Where are the gaps? Now, let me put that to you, Phil Robinson. Obviously, we've had a real focus right now on Ukraine, but what about the next war?
Well, I think we've, first of all, demonstrated after the events of the 24th of February that, you know, we are agile, playing to Godfrey's point. And the way that, you know, particularly NATO air nations have come together to deliver that response to what's happened in Ukraine has been hugely impressive. And that continues on a daily basis. As you know, people are doing that now. I suppose, you know, touching on some of the points that were raised earlier is we talk about the next conflict, but what is the next conflict? What does it look like? Who is it with? And obviously, it's very difficult for us to be able to make sure that we are equipped, trained and ready for that conflict when we're not actually sure what that conflict is going to be. So coming back to your first question, really, I think the important thing is that agility and the ability of us to be able to adapt. And no one nation, maybe with the exception of the US, can cover off all the bases, which is where our partnerships come into play. And again, you know, going back to the Ukraine crisis, we're seeing that on a daily basis. So are we equipped for the next war? I think we're well placed. Could we be better? Yes, I think we could always be better. And I think having forums like this is one of those things where we can have those discussions and look where we need to make sure that we maintain our focus.
Thank you. So Jeremy Poulter, let's talk about agility. Do you think from Microsoft's viewpoint that actually there is this sufficient cooperation for you to be able to feed through to enable more agile forces to develop?
Sure. Great question. I think probably need to start by going back to what we mean by agility in context of the digital age. And I think there's something about changing the benchmarks of what's acceptable. I think earlier in the presentation, Will Roper talked about the speed, real time, of adapting software in the battles, or the equivalent, so for competitive advantage, whether that's Formula One or whether it's the America's Cup. So I would say when we look at agility, we're talking about changing software in flight for air and space, because that's the only way to generate the edge there. And if you work back from that type of agility, what are those critical things that you need to put in place to be agile? And it's also back to those foundational technologies. So are you working in a modern cloud-like environment? Do you have people that understand DevSecOps and can field that? Do you have an acquisition system, certification system that allows you to accredit changes, not just to peripheral systems, but core mission systems in either crewed or uncrewed systems? Because this is what's happening in other industries now. So this isn't science fiction. If this is the benchmark for now, where are we today? And I would sense that if I look around the room, that if we're really honest with ourselves, we're at the very early stages of embracing that type of agility. So I'd like to see is really an acceleration in that through partnerships, back to the other part of your question, both with air forces and space forces, but with companies such as those represented, the Frimes and those behind, but also some of those innovative startups that really can bring a different perspective and indeed a far more born in the cloud, born in digital era type approach to generating software with the agility that I think defence and air and space badly needs right now.
Thank you, Jeremy. Well, let me bring in Justin. Justin, this question has come through from Stuart Ather from BAE Systems, actually. What challenges does the concept of agile combat employment pose for the whole force? Do you think that industry and military are responding effectively as one team?
Thanks, Stu. No. I think because it hasn't been grasped as a nettle outside of the US doing agile combat employment, in Europe, but of course they have the scale and the logistical support and the pre-pro infrastructure to draw on to some extent. I think one of the bigger issues is not, of course, the ability to put two or four ships of aircraft into dispersed, ideally civilian or dual-use locations and run a few sorties from them. But it's the ability to, for example, support things like Alice for the F-35 when you're dispersed, to allow you to actually do things on a sustained basis, to do the same with live weapons, because, of course, how do you certify live weapon loading or sorties from non-military cleared standard air bases? It's a complete nightmare with the MAA. That just needs to be looked at, not just here, but in lots of countries. All of the stuff that would actually go around it, I know the RAF regiment would absolutely jump at the idea to go and be involved in the actual day-to-day planning of ops, which dispersed operations would require, because you'd have to be securing aircraft personnel and logs on non-MOD bases. So I think the agility is there in the system to do it, but it's going to cost quite a lot of money. It will have to inevitably either come because the politicians decided to suddenly give a load of money, and there'd have to be a really good case for that, or because you decided to stop doing a load of other stuff to fund it. So there better be a capability argument to back it up as to why you need to do it, which is not a hard argument to make, but it does need to be made in public. And then I think you'd find that the system and industry would come along pretty quickly in finding ways to make it work. It wouldn't be pretty at first, and you'd still have serious problems with the vulnerability of your deep maintenance, so your long-term fleet management capability. But as the Ukrainians have shown, being able to fight for a couple of months is far better than being able, just being knocked out on your few main bases in the first week. So progress would be good. I think there's plenty of capacity.
Do you agree?
No, I don't actually. I think some of it I do agree with, but throwing money at a problem never solves it, in my view. What I would suggest is we're going to take a little step back and say, what do we mean by agile concept, agile employment? What do we mean by austere basing? What do we mean by, how does that exist in an air and space force environment of the future? So I'd take a little step back and not say, let's throw lots of money at it and lots of resources at it. I actually say, let's go and do some experimentation with purpose to understand where the gaps really are. Because I think the perception of gaps today will not be the real gaps. Analysing anything that's complex, complexity is never something that is you first thought of. It can be something completely random. And I think part of where we are, and we talk about agility and doing things differently, is actually start with some of the basics. Have we got the right people and skills to be agile? Have we then got the way of doing that, the how, the processes, at the operational processes, as that Dr. Roper mentioned before, then worry about what we're going to apply it to. So using a bit of Simon Sinek stuff that we heard before and start just take a step back and go through that. But I think we've got to do some experimentation at purpose to try and tackle some of the things that Justin said, but just throwing out en masse resourcing and money at it, it won't work. It won't work.
Just two fingers to that, if I may. You can go a hell of a long way by asking frontline fighter pilots and their maintenance crews what they would need to go and do dispersed ops, because they'll give you a list that's not enormously long, but it's generally very complicated and difficult and doesn't fit within existing support mechanisms or procurement, or certainly within RDEL, the operating budget. And so ultimately, while I agree just throwing money at the problem isn't there, the main thing standing in the way of practical at-scale experimentation is money and the approvals process that people, rightly or wrongly, feel would be in the way of actually going and doing these things.
Phil Robinson, let me bring you in.
I mean, I don't disagree that there is a long way to go in terms of the Royal Air Force's delivery of agile combat employment, but we do it on a daily basis. It just depends really what it means. So, can we do air defence of the UK from different bases within the UK? Yes, we can, rather than the sort of traditional bases that we're using, and that is agile combat employment. Have we bounced various different assets from all the different fleets around Europe as a result of the Ukraine crisis and delivered combat effect? Yes, we have. But as I say, there's a scale in terms of where you need to go, particularly when you're starting to look at high-end warfighting. So, we can definitely deliver capability now. Those questions in terms of asking the maintainers, I was out in Turkey, 2 weeks ago, and asking exactly those questions. So we are doing a lot of that work. So, but I'm not saying that we're all the way there by any stretch of the imagination. There's certainly a lot of work to do.
Phil, can you take this question as well that's come from Phil at Wavell Room? The recent cancellation of the Mosquito seems to be the unscrewed elephant in the room, like the expression. Uncrewed. Oh, sorry, I've misread that one. There we are. Anyway, what lessons can we learn from this?
I mean, I think the concept of Mosquito was exactly some of the things that have been talked about here, was trying to get into the sort of the agile area of procurement and think fast. But I think importantly, not to be afraid to fail. And maybe if we'd been doing something like that 5-10 years ago, we would have just continued with the program. So I think that, we as Air Forces, we talk to our people all the time and say, don't be afraid to fail. But, it's not often that is acceptable. So, I think there's definitely lessons to be learned, and those lessons are being taken away. But I think that if there are other programs that go like that in the future, we shouldn't be afraid of that, because that's the only way really that we're going to learn and we're going to become more agile.
Well, Godfrey?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I see it as a real positive that we have gone as far as we could go, and someone has taken the decision that, all right, we're not going to crack it, we're not going to throw money at it any longer. And ultimately, that's the approach that we would want to take as we build up our space capability. We've got a bunch of operational capability demonstrators coming along the line. And I would like to think that I would have the information available to stop a particular program should that need to be done if it looked like that we weren't going anywhere. And we've got some big decisions coming along. We're spending £1 billion on a proliferated LEO, low Earth orbit ISR system. The reason that we are stepping through 1 satellite, then 2 satellites, then 3, is to see what works and what doesn't work. So we don't set a bunch of requirements right at the beginning, spend 10 years trying to get to them, and by the end of it, all the requirements have changed anyway. So I see it as a real positive.
And how do you ensure that mindset, that agile mindset of being able to change and leave something behind that has put so much effort and money into, how has that developed during your time? How has that happened, do you think?
It's about bringing the culture of doing that. It's bringing the teams together, understanding that it is okay to fail, with the mantra of fail fast and those sorts of things. It's about, having the ability to put it into practice. It's about leading from the top on that particular front. And so from a Space Command perspective, with DSTL, with defense equipment and support, it's about ensuring that all of us in leadership positions think the same thing. And actually it comes back to a point that I think James was making about data earlier. is that we need to have the right data to make those decisions if it comes to a significant decision like that.
Let's move on to another question. Are our militaries being seduced by technology and the most advanced capabilities possible? And is this focus, will this become a strategic weakness because of this hyper-focus on the latest technology, where in fact we should be also keeping an eye on more conventional technology? Let me put that to you as well.
One of the things that it's interesting as a 30-year airman coming into the space domain, I didn't have any sort of preconceptions of what this is like. So, I'm pretty open to ideas of where we might go in the future. And actually, it's not lasers from space, as we were joking about just before. But it's actually, I come back to data. One of the big things that we're trying to do at the moment, you take our Space Operations Center, there's 16 different systems with different data coming in. Is it fused right now? Of course it isn't. So it's almost to get to the way an F-35 fuses all the data from its different systems and bring it into that operations center to ultimately to aid decision-making for the people that need to make decisions in the future. So, that's not that high-end seduced by technology. It is actually just making sure that we get the decisions right at the end of the day.
You're nodding your head.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with what Paul said. It's not technology for technology's sake. It's about doing things that allows you to unlock the value of what you've got today. My interactions with the Royal Air Force and International Air Forces at the moment is it's not about Gucci technology. It is about we need something to hear the data, to understand what we've really got today, and then build on that. And I think that's the real, I talked earlier about focus on today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. Today's challenge is about hearing and understanding what have we got today and making best use of it and build on that, not just going after that kind of next generation thing that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, Jeremy, I was going to say, does that mean that perhaps, though, forces may be taking their eye off the ball and really looking to what you're going to be needing in the future?
I think, to go back to the original question, are militaries being seduced? Then actually, I think the short answer is probably yes, frankly, because what you do tend to see is a lot of experimentation rather than innovation. Science and technology and experimentation, and there's absolutely a place for that. But actually, some of the hard yards and graft, in my view, and the true success of innovation to be match fit for the future, actually, the current really, comes with some of those, fairly begrudging, drudgery type things like innovating acquisition. So, and by innovation, my definition would be a step change in performance. So an acquisition, that's faster, cheaper, better. So a focus on some of those things that perhaps aren't ostensibly about the latest and greatest things. And again, many of you might think, coming from a big tech firm, I should be saying, yeah, absolutely, go and get the latest and greatest. It's working on those things first to be able to enable and unlock those foundational technologies to build upon those critical capabilities in the future. And I do think that in 5 years' time, I still believe the heroes will be acquisition and commercial and legal officers that have managed to unlock some of that with inspired leadership, so that then some of these latest and greatest technologies cease to just be science projects and actually are true embedded core parts of military capability.
Could I just add, it's interesting you say 5 years. I think one of the most successful bits of innovation history that the RAF has ever demonstrated was when they started setting F9-35 and F10-35 as fighter specifications, and P4-34 and P4-35, which were medium and then heavy bomber specifications, because specifically in 1934 or 35, they put a time limit on when they needed the innovation by, because they reckoned that they needed to be ready for a war, specifically with Germany, in 5 years. And that time period was what helped bound the question sufficiently to actually drive innovation choices. They were almost exactly right on the time frame, but it does map to now, which is the Ukrainians are buying us between 3 to 5 years between when the Russian military, whenever there's a pause, can pose us a credible conventional threat again at scale, because it will take them that long to reconstitute from their stocks and actually modernize and train people sufficiently. They're mobilizing about 1.6 million. But it'll take them years to get that working. But it's 3 to 5 years. They're not going to decide to play nice after this. They've burned all the rest of their soft power options, all of their economic coercion options, all their alliances. They only have hard power left. And so even if Putin falls, there will still be another bit of that regime. So let's say, take the innovation challenges, we've got 3 to 5 years to fix this, which is quite a short time. If you order a munition today, odds are you get it in 3 or 4 years' time. So it's not a huge amount of time, but that also bounds what level of technological ambition you want, and then make it about mission parameters. Where are our gaps in 3 to 5 years? If you want it, for example, to be uncrewed as an adjunct to mass, fine. Over what range, with what capabilities for what mission set? That gives you size, cost bound, and basic parameters to work with. It's no use saying that we want, for example, adjunct activities, and I think Mosquito may have found that the sums didn't quite add up in one particular band of answers, of saying, well, if we wanted this many and this price point, we actually can't put sufficient sensor and weapons capabilities to be a meaningful add-on in capability to the fast jets, more than the equivalent amount of investment in either the same core platforms or a different class of weapon. That's fine, but bound it in time and against the problem, and it'll probably be much better.
Phil Robinson, what do you make of Justin's timelines there? Do you think setting time limits is helpful?
Well, and I think we do set timelines. I think the difference is that maybe some of the timelines are not as ambitious as Justin has just articulated. A lot of the timelines clearly have been set pre the 24th of February. So, I mean, and I think if you look at the UK, and I know we're not the only nation, but the level of support that we've given to Ukraine, which is in excess of £1 billion, that really, I think, just demonstrates that, you know, from a government's perspective, they understand the gravitas of the situation. And, you know, there is clearly debates going on, not just in the UK, but across Europe about the size of defence budgets as well. And, you know, there are some nations that have already made announcements as well. So, you know, that work is going on. So I think, you know, from an air perspective, certainly from the Royal Air Force's perspective, we understand the gravitas of the situation. But again, coming back to one of our key strengths, it's that we're not going to be fighting this alone as the UK. The Royal Air Force are not going to be the only nation fighting this. And that was a realistic possibility in 39. And I know we had the rest of the empire, but we're part of a wider coalition. And I think, again, you know, NATO's response to what has happened in Ukraine has been, you know, very impressive to see, and has certainly surprised some skeptics.
Mm-hmm. So the expansion of NATO that we've seen in just the last month or so, to what extent do you think this will really move the dial in terms of operations going forward? I mean, I know there's small nations, but do you think it would just give an extra added impetus to the whole organisation?
Yeah, I think it will. And I mean, I wouldn't describe Sweden and Finland as small nations. I think, you know, they're very capable nations, and they've got very capable air forces that we've been working with, not just with the UK, but with NATO for some time. So integration-wise, I don't think it's going to be a problem.
Let me bring you in, Jeremy, because there's another area that we wanted to focus on. Just whether you think that we've got command and control right, do you think, from looking outward in to the military to fight information warfare as well as industrial warfare? Do you think the balance has become right?
That's a great question. Well, I think if I cast my mind back to previous service and about now 18 years ago, when I first landed in KAOC Experimental, I do remember, this is in the US Air Force at Langley, I do remember going through many of the use cases that we now see as contemporary benchmarks for command and control in the conventional sense in air and space forces. So it's taken broadly 18 years, in my view, to bring that sort of technology and innovation in. I think one thing to recognize when you look at command and control is, and this is something that we are discussing at the moment as part of my other sort of sideline as co-chair of the Defence Digital Industrial Strategy, is to consider industry as the sixth domain for multi-domain integration. And by that, I'm not really referring to the traditional sense of the whole force, at least in recent times. I'm thinking more in terms of the environments themselves. So command and control of cyber or space. Cyber is a domain dominated by the technology industry. So for command and control of that, when you think about digital age warfare and information age warfare, then there has to be some sort of relationship with those that actually operate and effectively control and run that domain. And I think we're seeing similar in space with the adoption of commercial space technology. So a relationship with those domains, I think, is critical for effective command and control to be able to achieve an effect that and in this case, it's really about defending democracy. So if that sounds a bit theoretical, let me just draw upon another example, a real example. So my colleague Rashmi provided a quote earlier, and that was actually from Brad Smith, May the 19th. Now, I don't know, looking around the room, how many of you recognize the name Brad Smith? Well, he happens to be the Microsoft president. I'm not seeing too many nods just yet. So I wonder how many people might raise their hand and say that they listened to his 20-minute speech at Envision UK and Microsoft event in Docklands in London on May the 19th, where he drew the analogy between the birth of Airpower and where we are now in the development of cyberpower. So I'm hoping that someone in the audience will ping me afterwards and said, I listened to that, and if not, then I hope that everybody else will listen to it. But he then went on to talk about integrated cyber effects in the battle space, and actually something that, in this case, the Russians have done extremely well in Ukraine. There have been failures. I think Justin talked about those. But integrated operations with cyber from a strategic to a tactical level, all things that we were seeing real time and responding to be able to help Ukraine to be able to survive in that onslaught. Real-time patching, active defense. And likewise, helping Ukraine government to move all of their government data very rapidly outside Ukraine for resilience, because without data today, you can't be a functioning democracy. So if we go back to the original question, then what does that mean then? So how do you operate to integrate, to command and control to achieve the effects you desire when you have what you might describe as other actors that have such profound effects? And I use Microsoft as an example. It is actually genuinely a great presentation you should watch as Airpower specialists, but it could be many others, and I think we could say the same. So it's understanding that governments themselves have to work within this environment, and then the concepts of how you actually work together and collaborate to achieve that effect will be profoundly different. It already is in an information battle. Sorry, that's a long answer, but hopefully that's given some food for the...
Very comprehensive. Thank you, Paul Godfrey.
I was just going to add, I was going to mention resilience, actually, because both Phil and I were lucky enough to perform the CAOC director role in the AFCENT CAOC and in CENTCOM. From the question, we have been fighting the war of the last 20 years from there, and it's been refined, and it works like clockwork. Could you fight the current war from there? Of course you could. But I think what Ukraine has shown and what Jez just articulated there is about resilience. So, one well-aimed missile or several hundred well-aimed missiles that takes out a particular node, can you do it from somewhere else? And certainly my experience with the USAF was they were doing that by moving certain functions back to CONUS in order to do that. And certainly from a space perspective, the conversation that we are having now with the US having led this, the space domain for a number of years now, is how do we provide them some resilience with the Space Operations Center as an example. So we have nodes around the world. We've all got one with those emerging nations that are getting into space right now. How do we take command and control if there's an issue, whether it's a real attack or a cyber attack, into these places and to continue? So I think resilience is probably the big thing.
And we've got another question which has come through. Is our industrial military relationship strong enough to compete with the same relationship in China? Ian, what's your take on that?
I think it is. I think if you go back from a UK perspective, back to 2018, the combat air strategy, that laid a foundation stone of doing things differently and doing different things. And that's led into the work that's gone through Team Tempest and FCAS, but it's also spurned out into SMEs working in the cyber domain, in the space domain, and starting to sort of get this ecosystem of doing things differently. There's more work to be done, but I think we've got a really solid foundation, and that's not just about talking about BAE Systems and large primes and large traditional defence supply chain. Paul talked about resilience. It's all the way down into academia, the pipeline of people, into the SMEs, and into our international partners as well. So I think we are in a good condition. I think the next, just in sort of put a good timeline on it, 3 to 5 years, is going to be a really important step of how do we keep, and in that combat air timeline, how do we sort of evolve that relationship to meet the demands of today, build that resilience that Paul's just said, and sustain it. And that's going to be really critical going forward. So that, domain of defence industry alongside the frontline commands is really important, and the relationship and how that works together in that, proper total force is going to work, is really important to meet the threats that we're seeing coming over the horizon.
Yeah, and actually I was going to get you, Justin, to answer the second part of this question, but feel free to answer the first part as well. But are we in danger of looking at warfare through a Western lens, and how should we consider alternative views and perspectives?
So to start on the second bit, I would say that the Western lens of warfare compared to, for example, the Russian or indeed the Far Eastern, in terms of particularly the Chinese, is probably mainly distinct from the fact that we prefer to use technology over bodies. We rely on technology to give us an edge to reduce the size of the force that we have to field and the number of people we have to lose in order to gain a given effect. I actually think that's something we should hold on to. I think it's probably the only sustainable way for us to compete, given demographics and public attitudes. But in terms of our current competitiveness, I mean, we're probably not going to approach the Chinese on PPP. I mean, if you look at purchasing power parity in the defense terms, you hear numbers between about 10 and 20 times their value for money in terms of dollar equivalent spent on combat air compared to the US. The Russians get about 3 or 4 times compared to the US. Now, that doesn't enable them to compete at the very, very cutting edge. We still have the edge there. But if you look at the iterative rate of improvement, they went, for example, from J10A to J10B in 5 years to J10C in 3 years. J10D has just been photographed in terms of new spine, upgrades to the SATCOM second gen, ESA radar and other bits and bobs. That iterative rate just keeps going. They have 4 J20Bs currently in production as early low-rate production types. What does J20C look like when it comes out? Because that will be 3 to 5 years, and it will continue at that rate. They don't throw away the stuff they started with either, so the J10As are all still there. My point being that we're not competing on that scale, and the qualitative edge is no longer where it needs to be to compete directly there either on the old ways. So the US is trying to do all singing, all dancing, connect everything together to try and increase the force multiplier effect. That will probably work, probably through brute force, because it's really hard what they're doing, just the scale of what they're trying to bite off, as our Lockheed colleagues were saying earlier. But it's worth also thinking of where we might compete on scale. For example, in Ukraine at the moment, small UAVs, which have been critical for small unit SA as well as particularly artillery targeting, their current life expectancy is 7 days. And that goes almost across all classes of UAV, whether that's TB2, that's partly why they didn't really want the MQ-1Cs, because they just lose them really quick. But if your life expectancy is 7 days, then you need to think about these things as munitions, not as vehicles. And that means you can build them without too much of an eye towards long logistics chains, without too much of an eye towards resilience long-term, long flight hours, all of that stuff. Keep the sensors cheap. And actually, we have an industrial base that can play in those grounds, particularly with additive manufacturing and things. We just need to avoid over-specifying the problem. The other thing the Ukrainians have done, which we can really learn from, is mix the high end and the low end very effectively. So, for example, Russian columns have been stopped by high-end Western ATGMs for the most part, but the actual killing's been done by Grads and 152 for the most part. So they've been mixing those high-end munitions to create the shaping conditions to then apply effect with mass. We probably don't want to do the same sort of mass as the Russians or the Chinese. We don't approve of it for collateral reasons, but also just scale. But we probably do need to have an answer as how we're going to kill at scale. The US, luckily for them, didn't sign up to the Cluster Weapons Ban Treaty, and so they have more options than we do. It's notable that a lot of our wargaming actually relies on us using US weapons that we're not allowed to have in real life. So maybe a grown-up conversation about if we are to fight peer adversaries in the Pacific and here, maybe we need to think about weapons that are actually designed to kill people in large numbers in the open rather than high-precision targeting of snipers and weapons teams in urban areas in the Middle East.
I wonder if I could just add, I think on the question, one of the things that troubles me slightly is, what do we mean by industry? I think we're a little bit loose with that definition. Is it the industry that we see today? Is it the industry of tomorrow? A combination of the two, the industry that's required? Or are we talking about industries to understand the interdependencies of having to work in this interconnected age? So it might be technology, it might be critical national infrastructure, there are many things, the space industry, all up. So I see a really strong relationship and an evolving relationship in a good way, and actually some novel partnerships across those industries. But I wonder whether there's a slight laziness in defining industry as just a blanket term, rather than perhaps engaging industries and some of the emerging critical partners that will be key to any sort of state-on-state future conflict.
And obviously, in the space industry in particular, there's been a proliferation of startups recently. Let me bring you in. Phil, I just want to ask you about this question which has come through. What does military interoperability across our European allies look like for space? And how has Brexit impacted this?
I'll start with the military bit first. So, actually bridging from the last discussion, ultimately, if we are looking at potential adversaries out there, it's about understanding where we add value to each other. It's about collaboration. Again, we are lucky from a space domain perspective that a lot of us are essentially starting from scratch in a number of different capabilities. So again, going back to the US Space Force, US Space Command, it's allowing them to take the lead to understand where we might add the most value with our capability programs so that we can plug and play and have that interoperability in this particular question. And so my last year has been about getting out and about, seeing whether it's bilateral relationships through Five Eyes into CSPO, the Combined Space Operations, or into NATO as well. What are the interoperability requirements for us? Sometimes you can wait too long for those. You just need to get on. I forget who was talking earlier, talking about translators, the sort of the bacon, the battlefield, air, comms node. We may have to do that in space at the end of the day in order to translate different data links, different waveforms, and so on. But we're having those conversations. And so, as always, this is ongoing. We're not going to solve interoperability tomorrow, but we start today.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're nearly coming to the end of this session, really out of time, but I did want just to squeeze one last one in, and this is about sustainability in aviation, but it's not something we've particularly touched on today. But the question is sustainability in aviation in warfighting a realistic and worthwhile aspiration? Should air forces be required to lead this work, or should we follow? Phil Robinson, could you take this?
In terms of sustainability
Yes.
with regards to platforms and munitions, is that?
No, I think it's more to do with sustainability in terms of synthetic fuels, for example.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, well, not my area of expertise, but there is a lot of work that's going on within the Royal Air Force and that's looking at exactly this area. And absolutely, I mean, the government have got targets which they're committed to, and we're obviously part of that, so we've got to be able to move forward. So I think increasingly as we go forward, we've got to be sustainable. And I think when you look at the regimes of what Russia and countries like maybe China stand for, and you look at what we stand for and many of the nations that are represented here, I think the sustainability piece absolutely fits in with where we want to be, which is one of our edges, really.
Okay, thank you.
There's a significant part of this, again, starting a new organisation. Space, you've got to launch stuff into space. There's a lot of carbon emissions there. We're tied with our parent, with Air Command into getting to net zero by 2040. And there are some great ideas out there. RAF Fylingdales, part of UK Space Command, for example, has an awful lot of peat around it. To use as can be bought and sold as carbon sinks, offsets. All of these sorts of different things. Actually, our vision in Space Command is to make space safe, secure, and sustainable. And that's about the sustainability of space as well as the way we are procuring space as well. We had it at the Defence Space Conference, but there's a huge discussion on access to space. We've talked about the importance of space as an enabler. With debris increasing all of the time, we need to be sustainable in the way that we start putting things up there and just making sure that we aren't the straw that breaks the camel's back, and all of a sudden you get what's termed a Kessler event at the tomorrow or the day after. And so we're doing an awful lot of thinking about this. Again, we have the advantage of starting an organisation right from scratch.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm afraid it is all we have time for. So many more questions, but I'm sure that we'll come to some of them tomorrow in day 2 of the conference. But I'd really like to thank the panel for some really insightful thoughts. So thank you.